who's got the sweetest disposition? One guess who? Who never starts an argument? Who never shows a bit of temperament? Who gets stuck with all the bad luck? No one but Donald Duck.
What the duck am I reading? Alright, I hope that little tidbit got you curious, because I'm about to tell you about one of the strangest and coolest things to ever come out of Disney. And it's a little bit of a long story, so go grab a sandwich or something. Now, when I say Disney Duck superhero, there's a pretty good chance that the first thing you're gonna think of is the good old Darkwing Duck, the terror that flaps in the night. Or perhaps it's this guy. Or if you're really hardcore, it might be this guy. Or these guys if you're just plain insane. Or Canadian. Because Canadians love hockey, am I right? Maple syrup. But, possibly surprising to most of you, there was actually a duck superhero long before either of these guys. And it was Donald Duck himself, with his alter ego Paperinik, or as he came to be known in English, the Duck Avenger. See, in most areas in Europe, Donald Duck is considerably more popular than, say, Mickey Mouse has ever been, to the point where for decades and decades, tons upon tons of Disney Duck comics have been made that all kind of introduce their own little concepts and characters. Heck, in Denmark alone, we've had a magazine straight up called Donald Duck and Company that has been running since the 40s and has been a weekly magazine at the very least since I was a kid, with the majority of its stories and artwork done by Italian creators. Plus a monthly collection called a Jumbo Book. I mean, there are Mickey Mouse and other Disney character stories too, but it's no coincidence that Donald is the one on the cover. Anyway, way back in 1969, three creators named Elisa Pena, Guido Martina, and Giovan Battista Carp, God, I hope I'm pronouncing those right, wrote a two-part story called Paperinik il Diabolico Vendicatore, which was translated in the US to The Diabolical Duck Avenger. Now, that doesn't exactly sound very superheroic, but hold your horses, we're getting to it. In this story, Donald received some ownership papers for a mansion called the Villa Rosa that was intended for his smug and annoyingly fortunate cousin Gladstone Gander, but decides that for once, he should keep the good stuff to himself. When he goes to inspect the place, he finds that it actually belonged to a gentleman thief known as Phantomius, who kept his identity secret by acting like a bumbling nobody when out of his costume. Studying his methods, Donald created his own identity, Paperinik, a name derived from Donald's Italian name Paulino Paperino and 1920s Italian comic book vigilante Diabolique, and used his new identity and gadgets to pull one over on relatives and other people that abused him, such as Gladstone Gander and Uncle Scrooge, who had a habit of really exploiting Donald for cheap labor in the comics. It was essentially an escapist character for Donald, allowing him to get some sweet, sweet revenge. But Ash, I hear you cry, that doesn't sound like a superhero. You said he was a superhero. Yeah, well, this was 50 years ago and shit changed, so shut up and let me continue. As the Paperinik character grew in popularity, his vindictive streak was toned down and he ended up developing into more of a comedic take on Batman-esque superheroes, sporting a series of gadgets created by Gyro Gearloose and fighting all manners of crooks and criminals across Duckburg. With that, he was then renamed the Duck Avenger in the US, or as I know him in Denmark, Stålanden, which literally translates to the Duck of Steel. But Ash, I hear you cry, and then I'm like, what? Because that's the third time you interrupt me. That comic you showed us in the beginning looked super hardcore. What was that all about? Well, that little Timmy is Paperinik New Adventures, and that's the comic we're talking about today. Basically, in the middle of the 90s, a group of Italian creators named Alessandro Sisti, Ezio Sisto, Claudio Schiaron, and Max Monteduro had the idea to try and develop Paperinik into a more serious superhero, and, in their own words, play Marvel with him. To do this, they created a whole new comic book series that sort of became a testing ground for new authors and artists to cut loose with Donald and tell much more advanced sci-fi superhero stories than had ever been done with a Disney character before. Essentially, they pulled a darker and edgier reboot, and they did it extremely well. The result was Paperinik New Adventures, often just shortened to PKNA, and this, ladies and gentlemen, this was Whittle Baby Ash's very first regular comic book. I still remember seeing the cover to that first issue way back in 1997 at my local supermarket and being in awe at the sight. A whole Duck Avenger solo comic book with way edgier art? Man, I was there! And every month for the next 50 issues, I would be there on release day spending my hard-earned allowance to see the new adventures of Donald Duck, superhero. All these issues you see me holding here, as well as a whole pile off screen, are actually the very same issues that I bought in the shop way back then. with some being in better shape than others. But for the sake of this video, we will be using some English translations provided by the online fandom. But now it's time to talk about the series itself. So basically PKNA is more or less its own little universe. In these comics, Donald, who is stated to have been PK for a while, has a job at the prestigious Ducklear Tower, a huge office skyscraper built by eccentric billionaire inventor Everett Ducklear, who has since left the country to live in a Tibetan monastery. While working for Channel 00 there, he one day accidentally finds a secret floor full of all kinds of crazy gadgets and meets his new and strongest ally, One, an artificial intelligence built by Everett Ducklear to keep track of all his inventions, some genius and some dangerous, and keep watch over the city. The two team up with One basically serving as PK's intelligence and tech provider. He gives him his new weapon, the X-Transformer shield, along with a new flying car in order for his superheroics to really take off. And from there, the two go up against anything from invading aliens, time travelers, rival nations, mad scientists, robots, alternate universe refugees, to much, much more zany stuff. So yeah, we're pretty far removed from the old days where Donald would drive around in his own little car and use wacky gadgets given to him by Gyrogearloose. In fact, we're pretty far removed from almost anything Donald Duck. Daisy, the nephews, and Uncle Scrooge are very rarely mentioned or seen, and instead Donald is surrounded by a whole new supporting cast. And to say the least, it's a wild bunch. There's One, of course, who is a highly advanced AI with a sense of humor. Conrad Kiwi, the old-school gumshoe reporter with a chip on his shoulder and a grudge against PK. Marianne Flagstar, an FBI agent he often has to work with. Urk, the super-strong traveler from an alternate universe where Native Americans and Vikings are at a centuries-long war. Sardum, the alien scientist turned living supernova with a grudge against the Aronian race who destroyed her home. And last but not least, there's Lila Lay, whose main purpose in the comic is to... Wow.
Duck tits, woohoo!
Yeah, the duck tits clip. Just those 4 seconds, from way back when. You want how much? Fuck you, I'm not paying that. Okay, you know what? You steal my Halloween video ideas, I steal your clip. How about that? We're even. Oh, you don't remember doing that. Yeah, well, guess what? I remember it so you don't have to. Goodbye! Honestly, do you believe that guy? Okay, I'm kidding. Lila is actually a really freaking badass character, but I do get a good laugh out of these fan service panels of her. She's basically Donald or PK's main support, and usually the one he has to go to when he gets wrapped up in time travel shenanigans. Which happens a lot more often than you might think. So, as you can probably tell from that rundown of the characters, this series creators weren't kidding when they said they were playing Marvel. Tons of these characters and many concepts in the series, I gotta admit, are not so subtly lifted from various other comic book heroes. PK is already a more lighthearted version of Batman, and Everett Ducklear is basically a hodgepodge of characters like Mr. Fantastic, Iron Man, and Doctor Strange, with a little bit of Iron Fist thrown in there. Conrad is an obvious Jonah Jameson pastiche, Sardum is a really pissed off Silver Surfer, Lila is like a robot version of Lois Lane, and Urk is... Okay, I'm kinda stumped on that one. But really, the list just goes on. Thankfully though, they all have plenty going for them to separate them from their inspirations. Lila, for instance, is an android time police officer from the future who is undercover as a 20th century journalist because that's her jurisdiction. And Conrad isn't actually the chief at his paper, but is a more classic, gruff, snoopy reporter of Maui heritage who does occasionally prove to have a heart. And Everett is actually shown to be a compulsive inventor who literally cannot stop himself from creating weapons, which is what caused him to abandon his riches and go to Tibet in the first place. Tweaks like these go a long way to make them feel less like copies and more like their own characters, albeit ones with very obvious sources of inspiration. And it's not just the characters that take inspiration from all over the place, the stories definitely do too. See, the series did have continuity, quite a bit of it in fact, but each 60-something page issue was always a self-contained story, barring one 3-parter down the road, and all done with rotating writers and artists, so Donald's adventures could vary wildly. As a result, it was pretty rare to find 2 issues in a row that felt quite the same. Where one story might be silly, the next might be dead serious and complicated, and the art could be very different as well, almost making it feel like you were reading a different series from issue to issue, if it weren't for the core cast and themes to keep you tethered. In fact, considering that I started reading these when I was like 7 or 8 years old, some of these stories were very advanced, and I definitely remember sometimes reading them and not quite understanding the whole plot until I reread them when I was a little older. Oh, and by the way, have I mentioned that the art is awesome? No matter how you feel about some of the more cartoony art styles, these comics went out of their way to break the mold from regular 6-panel Disney Duck comics, really playing around with composition and color, and while some of it does come across a little corny, some of it is drop-dead gorgeous. I'm especially fond of any issue drawn by Lorenzo Pastrovicio and Claudio Scarron. I mean, look at this stuff! When did Donald ever look this cool before? Alright, so good characters, good stories, good art. That's all well and good. But we all know there's a very specific reason why we read superhero comics. And that is to see them fight supervillains! And surprisingly for a series that draws so much inspiration from all sorts of superheroes, Donald doesn't actually fight a lot of supervillains in the costume criminal sense. But he did build himself a little rogues gallery over time, as some foes proved to be more formidable than others. PK's core enemies were the Avronians, a race of alien emotion vampires that conquered worlds and literally ate the population's feelings in order to convert them into mindless zombie slaves called Cool Flames that did their every bidding and... Okay, actually saying all that out loud is making me realize how fucking dark these guys are. Tons of issues deal with these bastards, whether PK is fighting a mutation or mercenary of theirs that has reached Earth, has to deal with the military making boneheaded deals with them, the wrong people getting their hands on their technology. So even if the stories varied a bit, there was still a good chance the Avronians somehow had their grubby mitts in it somewhere, making the series feel more concise. And while the Avronians were largely a horde species that was split up into various very strict social castes, a few of them did actually get enough personality that they became characters in their own right. There was the genetic scientist Garthan who developed a fascination with Earth's literature over time, the scientist and warrior pair Suster and Sundag who'd often be leading invasion forces, and Grodon, a shape-shifting spy sent to get a closer understanding of Earth. All very interesting variations of the same basic concept. Outside of the Avronians, there was 2, an AI created to be a backup in case one ever shut down or became corrupted. Being on constant standby drove 2 insane, however, resulting in him making it his mission to destroy 1 so he could take his place as the core intelligence in Ducklair Tower. So basically he's like a super aggressive Windows update. Fuck, not now, go away! And then there was the Raider, who is without a doubt one of the coolest characters in the franchise. The Raider was a time-traveling thief working for an organization called, the Organization. Great name there, guys. He would travel back and forth in time to steal valuables, but be very careful to not fiddle too much with the time stream. He was a big hawk-like guy, and he could be nearly impossible to actually pin down, since his time traveling basically worked like teleportation, and he was always a hassle to deal with. And honestly, he was not really that much of a villain. He very often sought Donald's help when something was disrupting the time stream, and occasionally helped him when the very strict time police tried to stop him from preventing terrible tragedies from happening. So he was less of an enemy and more like a big, burly, hairy man version of Catwoman. Huh. You know, I think I've read that fanfic. Much like with the Avronians, the conflict between the time police and the organization often gave birth to other baddies and catastrophes of the issue. From waves of nothingness eating all of time like the Nothing from the Neverending Story, to rogue time police officers causing trouble in the present, or organization members forgetting the rules and screwing with time for their own gain. So really, despite what I said before about the varying tone of the series, only a select few issues really end up feeling like they come out of left field. Like fighting a gargoyle summoning warlock in the fog, or being transported to a war in an alternate universe full of giant robots. Look man, it's superhero comics, like this stuff just kinda happens sometimes. And these comics were freaking brimming with content, I gotta tell you. Cause if ever you felt like you weren't getting enough from the main story, most of them featured little 7 to 8 page bonus stories at the end, focusing on various side characters, like Angus doing some snooping, Lila trying to live a normal life even though she's an android, or Everett learning valuable lessons at the monastery. And sometimes they even introduced characters that would become important later, like Trip, the Raider's son, whose side stories where he duels his own superhero stories in class were always some of my favorites. And this is where the artists really get to go nuts. Just look at some of these. A washed out effect on Conrad's stories, some really out there experimental stuff in the stories about the actor Burton Laval in the 23rd century, and whatever the hell is going on in the Life of Evron stories. It's really quite a sight. Okay, I know what you're thinking. I have to be done by now. There can't possibly be any more content for each issue. Psych! On top of all that stuff, the comics would often include these info pages. Now, I don't have these in scans, but in my issues, that'd usually be schematics over things like Donald's X-Transformer shield explaining all his powers like localized time freeze, flight, shape-shifting, and density control, or even info pieces about Avronian physiology, or of the Time Police's uniforms. They just really went all out to build this world and show us that, for as silly as the idea of a Donald Duck superhero comic sounds at its core, they put a lot of thought into the series. And even when there weren't any blueprints or world-building articles, there'd usually be full character profiles of the new characters introduced in that story. These covered everything. Where they live, where they came from, abilities, personal traits, ambitions, weaknesses. They even usually included a bit trying to describe what their voice sounded like. In a comic book! Look, I know I'm coming across as overexcited here. Some of my love for this series definitely comes from nostalgia, and I'm not claiming that these are some of the most complicated characters or stories ever written or anything. But keep in mind, I was like 7 or 8 when I started reading these. This is what taught me to consider a character's goals, their background, the presence they're supposed to carry, all the things needed to give them an identity that elevates them above bad guy or good guy. So yeah, this series definitely had quite the effect on me. I mean, I already liked superheroes because, of course I did, I was a kid. And there were shows like Spider-Man and Batman the Animated Series around to show me that superhero stories could be a little more complicated than just punch the bad guy in the face. But this was the first time where I went myself every month and willfully paid with my own allowance to read the next adventure. And every time I did, I'd be rewarded with a bonus story, or a world building article, or a character profile. And it was just amazing to me. I still pick these up every now and then to reread them, and every time I do, I enjoy myself greatly. In fact, I think I'm gonna describe my 5 favorite issues to you, just real brief, to give you a taste of just the kind of stuff you could find in this wonderful series. You ready? Alright, here we go! As early as issue 4, Earthquake shows Donald encountering the well-intentioned scientist Professor Morgan Fairfax, who seeks to create more landmass to fix overpopulation and in the long run eliminate world hunger and wealth imbalance. But he plans to do so by blowing up the entire west coast with controlled earthquakes, which would kill millions of people. And one who is programmed to consider long-term benefits may not be on Donald's side on this one. This was one of my first encounters with the well-intentioned extremist villain archetype, and it was a badass action story. Plus, it introduced FBI agent Marianne Flagstar, who would become a powerful ally of PK in the future. In issue 10, Trauma, the eponymous mutated Evronian super soldier is dug out of the prison planet he is kept on and sent to Earth in order to eliminate PK. But this is no ordinary Evronian. Not only is he large, powerful, and far smarter than most of his kin, he can also project people's fears and insecurities into their mind, forcing PK to power through painful childhood memories in order to defeat him. Not only is the art in this issue gorgeous, but Trauma was such a formidable opponent that it took PK getting into a powered battlesuit to go toe-to-toe with him at all, and he still remains one of the most well-remembered and talked about villains in the series. In issue number 22, Fragments of Autumn, Lila is charged with assault on a fellow time police officer and has to stand trial since due to earlier events, androids are now considered sentient beings in the 23rd century. But she claims to have done what she did due to strange visions, and they may all point back to her original designer Leonard Vertigil, who had more than a passing interest in his creations. This was one of the more emotional issues of the series, presenting a villain with a rather unique motivation up to that point, and it truly made it clear that Lila was more than just a machine. In issue 39, The Day That Will Come, Donald is brought to the Time Police's prison located beyond time to stand trial for the many times he has obstructed their work, right as the Raider invades the place in order to break out his fellow organization members. Unfortunately, this includes Cronin, who used to carry the Raider name before him, and he wants it back. Sometimes all you need is a cool action story, and The Day That Will Come is a great one thanks to Cronin's brutality and badassery, as well as Raider and PK's chemistry as characters. Definitely a big favorite. Also, Cronin's profile page describes his criminal record as unreadable because of the stains, which is just hilarious. And finally, issue 46, In the Shadow. I've been watching, I've been waiting in the shadows for my time. Do you mind? Anyway, In the Shadow sees Evronian scientist Suster attempt to steal a data pack from PK containing Sadum's memories after she sacrificed her life, putting an end to the Evronian Empire in a 3-parter a few issues prior. He does this by sending his band of space mercenaries and their terrifying bioweapon called the Mother after PK, and tries to use Sadum's consciousness to claim her power in order to reshape himself as a god. It is without a doubt one of the darkest issues of the series, and a good reminder of who Sadum used to be before her rage consumed her. So yeah, there you go. These are just a few of many great issues of this series. And since it keeps bouncing back and forth between sci-fi and time travel and superheroes and fantasy, I like to think there's a little bit for everyone in here. Now, sadly, as cool as this series was, its sales did start to decline, and eventually Paperinik New Adventures ended with a double issue titled What If, wherein Everett Douglas used a magic book to see how the timeline might have changed if the adventures detailed in the first 3 issues had turned out differently, and pluck out the part he needed to rewrite events for an as of yet undisclosed reason. Also, sadly, the series never actually got an English language release. Until 2016, when IDW Comics started releasing the series under the title Duck Avenger. So if this video has gotten you even a little curious, I suggest you pick those up. But while the series known as PKNA may have ended, the franchise was far from over. What If led to a retool of the series that fans often called PK2, where the status quo was shaken up considerably and the story shifted into more of a long story arc. And when PK2 ended, the whole series was rebooted into a series called Pikapa. And in recent years, they've started doing an actual sequel to the original PKNA comics with the PK New Era stories that I still haven't actually read myself. So there's still plenty of PK material. And on top of all of that, there was actually a video game for PlayStation 2 and GameCube. I never got a chance to play this as a kid. I remember seeing it on a shelf at the mall exactly once and never getting it. And now it's on the PS Store. This is the missing piece of my childhood. This is the one piece of PK media released in Denmark I never got to experience. And it's right here. Oh my god, this is gonna be awesome. Hey, thanks for watching. We're talking about the video game in the next episode, but there's still lots more comic books to talk about. So if you'd like to hear me dip into PK2, Pikapa, and PK New Era in the future, tell me in the comments below. And if you happen to be a PK fan yourself, tell me about some of your own favorite characters and issues. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and press the little bell to be notified whenever new episodes come out. Or to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, which you can find in the description below. I'd also like to thank John Algets and my other patrons for their support. If you'd like to support my work, you can do so via my Patreon page, also available in the description below. Once again, thank you for watching, guys. Duck on!